What does it say about a culture? That an 11th century poet, an 11th century poem can compete with when I say the following words, almost everybody in this room will have images from childhood, from youth, from young adulthood, and for those of us less fortunate, for years after young adulthood. Ferdowsi, Nizami, Ganjabi, Sa'di, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, and Hâfez. Each one of those words evokes memory. It says something else about the culture of the people for whom is a man who in mythological terms represents many thinking Iranians, for a long time many thinking Iranians, a healthy skepticism about the establishment. A healthy skepticism even for people who have religious faith, a reminder that doubts are part of things. Sa'di and his Golistan reminds us that style counts, that practical philosophy counts, that compromises in the name of doing better things later may be necessary, that seeing the world counts. In the case of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, lives are practical and sometimes difficult, and in your culture, those of you who are Iranian by birth, in your culture, spirituality has to have its place. So at least some of the time, people nod to what Rumi represents. Meanwhile, you can be thinking, well, wait a minute, I'm not finding the parallel sorts of things in the culture where I'm living now. And that's another instance of what is special. I'm not using the words better or worse, what's special and distinctive about the culture behind the text, which we'll be examining for the next several days. And then there's Hâfez. In what culture do people go to a text from the 14th century to find out what they should do tomorrow? In what text can people go from the 14th century, well, for that matter, in English and French and German, to what text can they go and actually read the text today without special training? And there Hâfez is with a world of iham, of ambivalence, reminding us that everything in the world is in the world and it's alive and important, and yet behind or above or around all of the things that are part of this world is that other world that is just as significant and living. But Ferdowsi is a special case. All these other poets seem to represent, for many Iranians, the special nature, the special value of their culture because of the Persian language which they use, and because of the things that they have said and the way they have said those things. Talks to the national language and myths. He represents a bridge of cultural continuity. He represents, for some people, the national history. People today routinely, and without thinking about it, talk about that place north of Shiraz as Takht Jamshid. Jamshid never lived. Or if he lived in mythology. But who's to say that mythology is not just as important historically as actual history? So it so happens that in Ferdowsi's day, and before Ferdowsi's day, during the Sassanid period, people had no recollections of the Achaemenids, of Hâfez, before Alexander the Great. So when people went by this place north in Mardash, this place north of Shiraz, the king they thought was most important and probably was responsible, somebody they learned about from their special Shâhnâmeh history, Jamshid. So it's the throne of Jamshid. And we might not forget that that may be a better name for it than an historical name. Because the history of a culture can be what people think the history of their culture is, as much as what the scientists today say is the history of a culture. But Ferdowsi is more than that. There are many people for whom Ferdowsi is a voice that describes for them, that identifies for them, their cultural identity as Iranians. It's not the only way, but lots of people go to Ferdowsi and want to find their Iranianness in him. And then there are the stories. My wife tells me that when she was a child, they had a person who worked for the family who knew no Persian, had no education, spoke in Azerbaijani Turkish, and every night for 6 months, the 5 or 6 kids who were of the age to listen, she told him a piece of the story of Zahaka Mardush, and he couldn't wait for the following evening. This story, this woman knew, not because she had any connection with Shâhnâmeh or Ferdowsi directly, but because the stories and what lay behind the stories were then and remain part of living culture. And then there is the business of Ferdowsi's poetry. And as a parenthesis, I should say that my exposure to Ferdowsi and his Shâhnâmeh has convinced me that the one aspect of it that is least treated, everybody knows how to say back what great poetry this is, but Ferdowsi's style and what makes the poetry poetic is something that's not talked about as much as Saadi, Saqqa Mumtaneh, or Hâfez, Ijaz, and the qualities of other poets. We'll get to it. In any case, we could say lots of wonderful things about Ferdowsi, but this Ferdowsi Teach-In at Texas is not a tribute to him and his Shâhnâmeh. We can say that for next year. It's not the 1000th anniversary of his completion of Shâhnâmeh. All over the world there'll be all sorts of events. This 3-day event, our Ferdowsi Teach-In at Texas, is just a look by students and some faculty and some other lovers of Ferdowsi at the appreciation of the poet and his poem today. That is, where does Ferdowsi stand? How are people looking at him? What are they writing about him? In the program that you received, I've listed 34 items of things that have appeared in the last 20 or 30 years. In the English language, hundreds of things have appeared. If we had English and French and German or what have you, it might reach 1,000. Iran, more is being written about Ferdowsi today, perhaps in any other period in history. For me, in introducing this teach-in, that appreciation of Ferdowsi means 10 questions. Not that we'll have answers to those 10 questions, but 10 questions are there in the back of our minds as we study Ferdowsi in classes and talk about it in seminars. One, what is the state of the text of Ferdowsi Shâhnâmeh? That is, the Shâhnâmeh we read today has what connection with Ferdowsi? Let me give you an example. Hâfez didn't prepare an edition of his own poetry, but within a generation after his death, there were several manuscripts and families of manuscripts, and slowly but surely people reached a consensus as to what the true divan, the authentic divan of Hâfez is.